There are moments in life when death reaches out its hand and almost takes hold, when the human body is pushed to its absolute breaking point and the mind begins to falter beneath the weight of impossible circumstances. And yet, in those moments, something extraordinary sometimes happens. People report hearing voices, sensing presences, or feeling the guidance of something unseen that pulls them back from the brink. Tonight, we explore the true stories of individuals who, at the very edge of existence, heard something that should not have been there and lived to tell about it. The phenomenon we are about to discuss goes by many names. Scientists call it the third man factor, or third man syndrome. The faithful might call it divine intervention, or the presence of a guardian angel. Skeptics attribute it to the misfiring of neurons in a brain starved of oxygen or pushed beyond its limits by extreme stress. But whatever you choose to call it, whatever explanation satisfies your understanding of the world, the stories themselves remain. They are documented, corroborated, and shared by people who have no reason to lie, and every reason to be believed. The term itself, the third man factor, originates from a poem by T.S. Eliot called The Wasteland, published in 1922. In it, Eliot wrote the haunting lines, "Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together, but when I look ahead up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you." Eliot was inspired by the account of the Antarctic explorer Ernest Shackleton, who described feeling an additional presence during one of the most harrowing journeys in the history of exploration. But Shackleton was far from alone in this experience. Over the century since his account was first made public, countless others have come forward to describe remarkably similar encounters. The phenomenon appears most frequently among those facing extreme physical danger in isolated environments. Mountain climbers, polar explorers, shipwreck survivors, and solo sailors have all reported sensing an unseen companion during their darkest hours. But it is not limited to adventurers. Survivors of car crashes, building collapses, and medical emergencies have described the same thing. There is something about the threshold between life and death that seems to invite this mysterious visitor. What makes the third man factor so compelling is its consistency across vastly different circumstances and cultures. Those who experience it describe strikingly similar encounters. The presence is almost always benevolent, offering comfort, encouragement, and practical advice. It often appears at the moment of greatest despair and vanishes the instant help arrives or the danger passes. Some report hearing a voice. Others feel a physical sensation of someone standing nearby, and still others experience a combination of both. The presence may feel like a stranger, or may take on the form of a deceased loved one. But in nearly every case, it provides exactly what the person needs to survive. Scientists have proposed numerous explanations for the phenomenon. Some suggest it is a coping mechanism, a way for the brain to create an imaginary companion to counteract the devastating effects of isolation and stress. Others point to the bicameral mind hypothesis, an idea proposed by psychologist Julian Jaynes in 1976, which suggests that ancient humans experienced their own thoughts as external voices, and that under extreme duress, this latent cognitive structure can resurface. Still others have noted that conditions common in extreme survival situations, such as hypoxia, hypothermia, dehydration, and exhaustion, can all affect brain function in ways that might produce hallucinatory experiences. But the scientific explanations, while fascinating, do not fully account for the phenomenon. How do we explain cases where the voice provides information the person did not consciously possess? How do we explain instances where multiple people simultaneously sense the same unseen presence without having discussed it? And perhaps most puzzling of all, how do we explain the cases where the presence disappears at the precise moment rescue arrives, as if its work were done? The late John Geiger, a Canadian author and explorer, spent years collecting accounts of the third man factor for his 2009 book of the same name. After interviewing dozens of survivors and reviewing hundreds of documented cases, he concluded that the phenomenon, whatever its ultimate explanation, represents a real and potent force for survival. The ability to access this presence, he argued, may be the most important factor in determining who survives seemingly impossible circumstances and who does not. What follows are true stories of people who heard voices, sensed presences, and received guidance from something that should not have been there. Some will chill you, some will move you, and all of them will leave you wondering about the mysterious forces that exist just beyond the edge of human understanding. The story of Ernest Shackleton and the Endurance Expedition is one of the greatest survival tales in human history, a saga of impossible odds overcome through sheer determination and the leadership of a man who refused to let his men die. But within this larger narrative lies a smaller, stranger story, one that Shackleton was reluctant to share for years after his return to civilization. It is the story of a fourth man who walked beside three exhausted explorers across the frozen wastes of South Georgia Island. In August of 1914, Shackleton and his crew of 27 men set sail from England aboard the ship Endurance. Their goal was audacious: to complete the first land crossing of the Antarctic continent. They would never come close. By January of 1915, their ship had become trapped in the pack ice of the Weddell Sea. For 10 months, the men lived aboard the stranded vessel as the ice slowly crushed it. In November, the Endurance finally sank, leaving the expedition stranded on the ice floes with 3 small lifeboats and whatever supplies they had managed to salvage. What followed was a journey of almost unimaginable hardship. The men camped on the shifting ice for months, watching their supplies dwindle and their hopes fade. Finally, in April of 1916, the ice floes began to break up, and Shackleton ordered his men into the lifeboats. For 7 days, they navigated through freezing seas and crashing ice before finally reaching the desolate shores of Elephant Island. They were the first humans ever to set foot on its rocky beaches. But Elephant Island offered no rescue. It was a barren outcrop far from any shipping lanes, and no one knew they were there. Shackleton made a desperate decision. He would take the largest of the lifeboats, a 22-foot vessel named the James Caird, and sail it 800 miles across the most treacherous seas on Earth to reach the whaling stations of South Georgia Island. If he succeeded, he could send a ship back for the men he was leaving behind. If he failed, they would all die. Shackleton chose 5 men to accompany him on the voyage. The navigator, Frank Worsley, and the veteran seaman Tom Crean were among them. On April 24, 1916, the James Caird set sail from Elephant Island, leaving 22 men behind to await a rescue that might never come. What followed was one of the most remarkable small boat journeys in maritime history. For 16 days, the 6 men battled through hurricane-force winds and waves that rose as high as 60 feet. They were constantly soaked and freezing. Their supplies were minimal, and navigation was nearly impossible, with only brief glimpses of the sun to guide them. By the time they finally sighted South Georgia Island, They were so weak they could barely row. But reaching South Georgia was not the end of their ordeal. The James Caird landed on the uninhabited south side of the island, and the whaling station at Stromness Bay lay on the north side. Between them lay a mountain range that had never been crossed. 3 of the men were too weak to attempt the journey, so Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean set out on foot with only a rope, a carpenter's adze, and a few screws pushed through the bottoms of their boots for traction on the ice. For 36 hours, the 3 men climbed and descended through unmapped terrain, battling exhaustion, altitude, and the ever-present danger of falling into a crevasse or being swept away by an avalanche. They had no sleeping bags, no tent, and no way to stop for more than brief rests without freezing to death. The landscape was a nightmare of ice cliffs, glaciers, and sheer rock faces. It was during this crossing that something extraordinary happened. Each of the 3 men, independently and without speaking of it at the time, began to feel that they were not alone. There was someone else with them, a 4th presence walking beside them through the frozen wilderness. Shackleton wrote about this experience in his 1919 memoir, South. He chose his words carefully, aware of how they might sound to a skeptical audience. When I look back at those days, I have no doubt that Providence guided us, not only across those snowfields, but across the storm-white sea that separated Elephant Island from our landing place on South Georgia. I know that during that long and racking march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountains and glaciers of South Georgia, it seemed to me often that we were 4, not 3. What makes Shackleton's account so compelling is what happened afterward. He had said nothing to his companions about the presence during the crossing itself. But when they reached safety and had time to rest and reflect, Worsley approached him. "Boss," he said, "I had a curious feeling on the march that there was another person with us." Crean then confessed to the same experience. All 3 men, exhausted beyond measure and fighting for their lives, had sensed the same invisible companion. Shackleton struggled to find words for what they had experienced. One feels the dearth of human words, the roughness of mortal speech in trying to describe things intangible, he wrote. But a record of our journeys would be incomplete without a reference to a subject very near to our hearts. The 3 men reached Stromness Bay on May 20th, 1916. The Norwegian whalers who saw them approach barely recognized them as human beings. They were filthy, emaciated, and wild-eyed, their clothing in tatters and their faces blackened by frostbite. But they had done the impossible. Within days, Shackleton organized rescue missions for the men he had left behind. After several failed attempts due to ice conditions, he finally reached Elephant Island on August 30th, 1916, and found all 22 men alive and waiting. Not a single member of the Endurance expedition died during the entire 2-year ordeal. It remains one of the most remarkable leadership achievements in history. And at its heart lies the mystery of the 4th man, the unseen presence that guided 3 broken men across a frozen wasteland to safety. T.S. Eliot read Shackleton's account and was so moved by it that he incorporated the imagery into The Wasteland, forever linking the explorer's spiritual experience with one of the most important poems of the 20th century. But Eliot changed one detail. In Shackleton's telling, there were 4 where there should have been 3. In Eliot's poem, there is a 3rd who walks always beside you. The change was poetic rather than literal, and the term 3rd man has stuck ever since. What makes Shackleton's experience particularly compelling is the quality of the witnesses. These were not ordinary men prone to flights of fancy or religious enthusiasm. Shackleton was one of the most celebrated explorers of his era, a man whose reputation rested on his cool judgment and practical skills. Worsley was a master navigator who had guided them across 800 miles of the world's most treacherous seas using nothing but dead reckoning and brief glimpses of the stars. Crean was a veteran of multiple Antarctic expeditions, a man who had already survived ordeals that would have broken lesser individuals. These were hard men, practical men, men who dealt in realities rather than fantasies. And yet all three of them, independently and without prior discussion, reported the same extraordinary experience. They felt a fourth presence walking with them across the mountains of South Georgia, a presence that was as real to them as their own companions. In the decades that followed, Shackleton's account inspired others who had experienced similar phenomena to come forward and share their stories. Many had been reluctant to speak for fear of being thought mad or unreliable. But Shackleton's willingness to include the experience in his official account gave them permission to acknowledge what they too had felt. The scientific study of the third man factor began in earnest in 1943, when a British neurologist named MacDonald Critchley conducted interviews with nearly 300 survivors of shipwrecks and aviation mishaps. He found that a significant number of them reported experiences similar to Shackleton's, a sensed presence that appeared during their ordeal and vanished when rescue came. Critchley's research was published in 1955 under the title The Idea of a Presence, and it marked the first systematic academic investigation of the phenomenon. Since then, researchers have continued to document cases and propose explanations, but no consensus has emerged. The third man factor remains one of the great mysteries of human psychology, a phenomenon that seems to sit at the intersection of neuroscience, spirituality, and the raw will to survive. On the morning of September 11, 2001, Ron DiFrancesco went to work like any other day. The Canadian-born investment trader had been working at Eurobrokers on the 84th floor of the South Tower of the World Trade Center for about a year. He was at his desk when the first plane struck the North Tower at 8:46 a.m. Like thousands of others in the complex that day, he watched in horror as smoke poured from the gaping wound in the neighboring building. At first, the workers in the South Tower were told to stay at their desks. The building was secure, the announcement said. There was no need to evacuate. But DiFrancesco received a phone call from a friend in Toronto who was watching the news coverage. "Get out of there," his friend told him. "Something is very wrong." DiFrancesco trusted his friend's judgment. He convinced a colleague named Mike to leave with him, and the two men headed toward the elevator banks. They had just left the trading floor when United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower at 9:03 a.m. The plane hit floors 77 through 85, slicing directly through the office where DiFrancesco had been sitting moments earlier. The wing of the aircraft cut through the trading room itself. Many of his colleagues died instantly. The impact threw DiFrancesco and Mike against the walls. Ceiling tiles rained down on them, and the building shook with a violence that seemed impossible. When DiFrancesco regained his bearings, he found himself in a world transformed. The air was thick with smoke, the lights had failed, and the screams of the injured and dying filled the darkness. DiFrancesco made his way to Stairway A, the only one of the tower's 3 stairwells that remained passable above the impact zone. He began to descend, but the conditions grew worse with every floor. The smoke was so thick he could barely see his own hands. The heat was intense, and he could hear the roar of fires burning somewhere nearby. At one point, he encountered a group of people in the stairwell who told him to turn back. There were flames below, they said. The only hope was to go up to the roof and wait for helicopter rescue. Several of his colleagues from Euro brokers were in this group, and they chose to climb. DiFrancesco hesitated. He started up with them, but the doors to the upper floors were locked, a safety measure designed to prevent smoke from filling the entire building. There was no way to the roof. DiFrancesco turned around and started back down, but the smoke was getting worse. His lungs burned with every breath, and his eyes watered so badly he could barely keep them open. He reached a landing somewhere in the impact zone and collapsed. He was certain he was going to die. Other people were lying on the landing with him, gasping for air. DiFrancesco thought about his wife, Mary, and his 4 children back home in New Jersey. He thought about how badly he wanted to see them again. And then, as he lay there in the darkness, something happened. A voice spoke to him. It was clear and calm and unmistakably male. "Get up," it said. The voice was not his own, and it did not come from any of the people lying nearby. It seemed to come from just over his right shoulder, as if someone were standing there. DiFrancesco felt not just the voice, but a physical presence. Something was there with him in the darkness, something that should not have been there. The voice called him by name. It told him he could do this. It told him to get up. If I ever hear a voice that clear, that calm, and that forceful, telling me to get up, DiFrancesco later said, I will do it. He got up. He did not know how he found the strength. His body was failing, and his mind was clouded by smoke and fear. But he got up and began to move again. The presence guided him, not with physical force, but with a certainty that seemed to override his own judgment. It led him back into the thickest of the smoke, back toward the fire. He ran into a wall, a sheet of drywall that had collapsed across the stairwell. But instead of stopping him, it provided a way forward. He pushed against it and found that it moved, sliding down to the next landing and carrying him with it. He continued down through flames and smoke, following the guidance of something he could not see. At some point, as he descended through the lower floors, the presence left him. It simply vanished, as if its work were done. DiFrancesco emerged from the building and ran. He was crossing the concourse when the south tower began to collapse. He was engulfed in the debris cloud, and the last thing he remembered seeing was a fireball rushing toward him. Ron DiFrancesco woke up in a hospital several days later. He had suffered severe burns on much of his body. His contact lenses had melted to his eyes from the heat. He had a broken bone in his back, but he was alive. He was, by most accounts, the last person to escape from the South Tower before it collapsed. He was one of only 4 people known to have survived from above the impact zone in that building. When the tower fell, everyone else who had been in those upper floors perished, including the colleagues who had convinced him to climb rather than descend. In the years since that day, DiFrancesco has spoken publicly about his experience, though it has not always been easy. He has struggled with survivor's guilt, with the weight of knowing that so many died while he lived. But he has also spoken about the voice, about the presence that guided him through the darkness. The faithful will have very little trouble understanding what that means, he has said. The more secular may believe it was my adrenaline-fueled synapses. Here is what I do know. If I ever hear a voice that clear, that calm, and that forceful, telling me to get up, I will do it. It made me get up. back on my feet, and I followed the voice back into the thickest of smoke and the fire. Maybe it was an angel, he has said on other occasions. I did not see the face of God, but I know somebody came and helped me. Whatever the explanation, Ron DiFrancesco is alive today because something reached out to him in his darkest moment and refused to let him die. DiFrancesco moved his family back to Canada after 9/11s, settling in Toronto, where he has worked to rebuild his life and find meaning in his survival. The scars on his body serve as daily reminders of what he endured. For years, he struggled with what therapists call survivor's guilt, the crushing weight of wondering why he lived when so many others died. 61 of his colleagues at Euro Brokers perished that day. The men and women who chose to climb the stairs rather than descend died when the tower collapsed around them. But DiFrancesco has also found purpose in sharing his story. He speaks at schools, corporate events, and gatherings of emergency responders about his experience. He talks about resilience and gratitude, about the importance of listening to that inner voice that tells us when something is wrong. He speaks about the voice that saved him, the presence that would not let him lie down and die in that smoke-filled stairwell. The phenomenon he experienced that day has been documented in many other 9/11 survivors as well. In the chaos and terror of that morning, numerous people reported experiences that seemed to transcend ordinary explanation. Some felt guided to exits they did not know existed. Others made split-second decisions that defied logic, but saved their lives. The attacks on the World Trade Center created a concentration of extreme survival situations in a single place and time, and the stories that emerged from that crucible have added significantly to our understanding of how the human mind responds to mortal peril. Brian Clark, another Euro Brokers employee who escaped from above the impact zone, has spoken about the choices he made that day and the strange certainty that guided him. He chose to descend when others went up. He chose to enter a floor filled with smoke to help a stranger. Every choice he made led him to survival, while those who made different choices perished. Was it luck? Was it instinct? Was it something more? Clark has never claimed to fully understand it, but he has acknowledged that the experience changed his understanding of what is possible. In June of 1985, two young British climbers named Joe Simpson and Simon Yates set out to conquer one of the most challenging peaks in the Peruvian Andes. Ciudad Grande, rising to over 21,000 feet, had been climbed before, but never by its treacherous west face. Simpson and Yates were ambitious, skilled, and perhaps a little reckless. They had no support team, no radio contact with the outside world, and only each other to rely on if something went wrong. Something went wrong. The two men reached the summit after several days of difficult climbing, but on the descent, disaster struck. Simpson slipped on an ice cliff and fell, landing with his full weight on his right leg. The impact drove his tibia up through his knee, shattering the joint and leaving him with an injury that at that altitude and in those conditions should have been a death sentence. Yates faced an impossible choice. To leave his partner on the mountain was unthinkable, but to descend with him seemed equally impossible. Simpson could not walk, could not stand, could barely move without screaming in agony. The only way down was for Yates to lower him, section by section, using their climbing ropes. For hours, Yates lowered Simpson down the mountain's ice-covered face. It was brutal, agonizing work. Simpson dangled helplessly at the end of the rope, unable to contribute anything to his own rescue. Yates above him fought against exhaustion and the bitter cold as he controlled the descent inch by inch. Then something went terribly wrong. In the darkness and the blowing snow, Yates unknowingly lowered Simpson over the edge of an ice cliff. Simpson found himself hanging in empty space, unable to climb back up, unable to reach any surface that might support his weight. Above him, Yates could feel the rope going taut, but could not see what was happening. He only knew that he was being slowly pulled from his precarious position on the mountainside. For over an hour, Yates held on. His hands were freezing, his strength was failing, and he knew that if he did not act, both of them would die. He made a decision that would haunt him for years afterward. He cut the rope. Simpson fell. He plunged through the darkness and crashed into a crevasse more than 100 feet below. By all rights, he should have died on impact. Instead, he landed on a small snow bridge suspended partway down the crevasse. He was alive, but he was alone, trapped in a frozen tomb with a shattered leg and no way out. Above him, Yates waited through the night, then descended to the crevasse the next morning. He peered into the darkness, but saw nothing. He called out, but received no response. Convinced that his partner was dead, Yates began the long journey back to base camp alone, overwhelmed by guilt and grief. But Simpson was not dead. He had survived the fall and now faced a new challenge, escaping from the crevasse. He could not climb up. The walls were sheer ice, and he had only one functioning leg. His only option was to go down, to lower himself deeper into the crevasse on his remaining rope, and hope that there was another way out. It was an act of pure desperation. To descend deeper into a crevasse is to move toward what should be certain death. But Simpson had no choice. He rigged his rope and began to lower himself into the blackness. What he found saved his life. At the bottom of the crevasse, he discovered a snow slope that led up to a crack in the ice. Sunlight poured through the crack. It was a way out. But escaping the crevasse was only the beginning of Simpson's ordeal. He still had to cross several miles of glacier and moraine to reach base camp, and he had to do it with a leg that was useless, a body that was ravaged by dehydration and hypothermia, and a mind that was beginning to fail. It was during this journey that Simpson began to hear the voice. He described it in his 1988 book, Touching the Void, which became a bestseller and was later adapted into a documentary film. The voice was not his own. It was calm, insistent, and absolutely certain. It gave him instructions. Set a goal, it would say. Reach that rock in 20 minutes. Then find another rock. Keep moving. Do not stop. You have to do this, this, and this if you are going to get there, the voice would say. Come on, keep moving, get up, and do it again. Simpson later struggled to explain the voice. It was not a hallucination in the traditional sense. He did not see anything, did not imagine a physical companion, but the voice was as real to him as any sound he had ever heard. It pushed him forward when his own will had completely failed. For 3 days, Simpson crawled across the glacier. He moved inch by inch, his shattered leg dragging behind him, his body screaming in protest with every movement. The voice kept him going. It did not allow him to rest for too long, did not let him surrender to the overwhelming desire to simply lie down and die. At one point during his crawl, delirious from pain and exhaustion, Simpson began to hear music. A song got stuck in his head and would not leave. Brown Girl in the Ring by Boney M. It played on endless repeat in his mind, mixing with the voice that pushed him forward, creating a surreal soundtrack to his desperate struggle for survival. He reached the edge of the glacier and made his way across the boulder field beyond it. He was so weak now that he could barely lift his head. The base camp was close, but he did not know if Yates would still be there. If his partner had already left, Simpson would die within sight of safety. In the early hours of the morning, Simpson crawled into the camp's latrine area. He was too weak to go any further. He called out, a feeble cry that he did not expect anyone to hear. But Yates heard him. The camp had been scheduled to break down that very day. Yates had been preparing to leave, still believing his partner was dead at the bottom of a crevasse miles away. But something had made him delay, and now, impossibly, his partner's voice was calling to him from the darkness. Joe Simpson survived. His leg required multiple surgeries, and he spent months in recovery. But he lived to tell his story, a story that has become one of the most famous survival tales of the modern era. The voice that guided him across the glacier has never been fully explained. Simpson himself is not a religious man and does not attribute the experience to divine intervention, but he has never denied what happened. "I do not think I would have been able to do what I did without that help," he has said. "The voice pushed me. It would not let me stop." Whatever it was, wherever it came from, it kept Joe Simpson alive when everything else had failed. The voice that guided Simpson has been analyzed by psychologists, neurologists, and survival experts. Some have suggested it was a dissociative response to trauma, a way for his conscious mind to externalize the survival instincts that were too powerful for his failing body to ignore. Others have pointed to the effects of severe dehydration and hypothermia on brain function, noting that altered states of consciousness are common in such conditions. But Simpson himself has always been careful not to explain the voice away. He is a rationalist by temperament, not inclined to mystical interpretations. But he also knows what he experienced. The voice was not his own. It did not sound like him, did not feel like him. It was separate, distinct, and absolutely real. In the years since his ordeal, Simpson has written multiple books about mountaineering and the psychology of survival. He has become a sought-after speaker, sharing his story with audiences around the world, and he has had time to reflect on what the voice meant and why it came. One of the most striking aspects of his account is the nature of the voice's commands. They were not grand or philosophical. They were simple, practical, almost mundane. Reach that rock. Keep moving. Do not stop. It was as if the voice understood that in Simpson's shattered state, he could not process complex thoughts or long-term plans. He could only focus on the next few minutes, the next few meters, and so the voice gave him goals he could achieve, targets he could reach, one tiny victory at a time. This pattern appears again and again in accounts of the third man factor. The presence does not speak in riddles or revelations. It offers practical guidance suited to the specific circumstances of the crisis. It knows what the person needs to hear and delivers exactly that. Simpson has also spoken about the moment the voice stopped. He was close to base camp, almost within sight of safety, when it simply vanished. For a terrible moment, he thought he had been abandoned. But then he saw the lights of the camp, heard Yates calling out in response to his cries. The voice had stayed with him exactly as long as he needed it, and then it was gone. That timing is another recurring feature of third-man experiences. The presence appears when the crisis begins and disappears when safety is reached. It does not linger or explain itself. It simply does its work and then withdraws, leaving the survivor to make sense of what has happened. In the spring of 1983, a 28-year-old mountaineer named James Sevigny and his climbing partner, Richard Whitmire, set out to climb Deltaform, a formidable peak in the Canadian Rockies near Lake Louise, Alberta. They were ascending a route known as the super couloir, an ice-filled gully that rises steeply through the mountain's face. The conditions were good, and the two men made steady progress. Then disaster struck. Without warning, a snowfield above the couloir collapsed. The resulting avalanche swept down the mountain like a freight train, catching both climbers in its path. They were carried more than 600 meters down the face, tumbling through ice and rock with nothing to arrest their fall. Sevigny lost consciousness during the fall. When he came to, he was lying in the snow at the base of the mountain. His body was broken. His back was fractured in 2 places. One arm was shattered, and the other hung limply at his side, the nerve severed by a broken scapula. His knees were torn apart, his ribs were cracked, and he was bleeding internally. Most of his teeth had been knocked out, and his face was so swollen he could barely see. A few meters away, he found Richard Whitmire. His climbing partner was dead. Sevigny was alone on a remote glacier with injuries that should have killed him. No one knew where he was. No rescue team was coming. He had survived the avalanche, but survival now seemed like a cruel joke. He lay in the snow and prepared to die. That was when he felt it. Something was there with him. He could not see it, but he could feel it as clearly as he had ever felt anything in his life. It was a presence, warm and nurturing, and it was standing just behind his right shoulder. "You cannot give up," the presence told him. "You have to try." The voice was female, though Sevigny did not recognize it as belonging to anyone he knew. It spoke to him not with words that he heard, but with communications that he simply understood, and it gave him practical advice. It told him to put on his jacket. It told him to follow the blood dripping from his nose, using it as an arrow to point the way. It told him to arrange the blood spatters in patterns that rescuers might see. Sevigny did as the presence instructed. He began to move, dragging himself across the glacier with one arm that barely functioned and legs that could not support his weight. The presence stayed with him, a constant companion that would not let him stop. For hours he crawled. The pain was indescribable. Every movement sent shockwaves through his broken body. But the presence kept urging him forward. It dispensed advice. It offered encouragement. It would not allow him to surrender. At one point, Sevigny broke through the crust of the snow and sank up to his waist. He was too weak to pull himself out. He thought the end had finally come. But the presence was still there, still speaking to him, still refusing to let him die. Eventually, Sevigny reached the base camp where he and Whitmire had left their supplies. But he could not crawl into his sleeping bag because his injuries were too severe. He could not light the stove because his hands would not work. He could not eat because his teeth were gone and his face was too swollen to chew. He sat down in the snow and realized that it was late afternoon. In a few hours, the temperature would drop and he would freeze to death. Then he thought he heard other voices, real voices, human voices, somewhere in the distance. He called out for help, a feeble cry that he did not expect to carry far. At that moment, the presence left him. It simply vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Sevigny felt a wave of loneliness crash over him. He thought he was hallucinating. He thought the presence had given up on him because it knew he was going to die. But the voices he had heard were real. 3 cross-country skiers were passing through the area, an extraordinary coincidence in such a remote location. One of them was a mountain guide. Another was an elite athlete. The third was a nurse. If you were going to be rescued in the middle of nowhere, you could not have picked 3 better people to find you. They heard Sevigny's cry and rushed to his aid. The presence had not abandoned him. It had left because it knew he was safe. James Sevigny spent months in the hospital recovering from his injuries. The list of damage to his body reads like a medical textbook. Broken back in 2 places, fractured arm, severed nerves, torn ligaments, cracked ribs, broken teeth, internal bleeding. By all medical logic, he should have died on that glacier. For years afterward, he could not talk about the presence without crying. The experience had been so powerful, so intensely personal, that words seemed inadequate to describe it. He did not know what it was. He did not claim to understand it, but he knew that it had saved his life. There is no way that I would have had the strength to get up and walk across that valley and do the things I did to survive, he has said, not without that help. The experience did not make Sevigny religious in any traditional sense. He does not attend church or subscribe to any particular faith, but he no longer dismisses the possibility that there are forces in the universe beyond human understanding, forces that sometimes reach out to us in our darkest moments and refuse to let us go. In the winter of 1984, a woman in her early 40s sat at home reading a book when something extraordinary happened. A voice began to speak to her, clear and distinct inside her own head. "Please do not be afraid," the voice said. "I know it must be shocking for you to hear me speaking to you like this, but this is the easiest way I could think of. My friend and I used to work at the Children's Hospital, Great Ormond Street, and we would like to help you." The woman, identified only as AB in the medical literature to protect her privacy, had no history of mental illness. She had never experienced hallucinations before. She was a healthy, stable, perfectly ordinary housewife and mother who had never given anyone reason to doubt her sanity. Now she was hearing voices. AB was terrified. She had heard of the children's hospital that the voice mentioned, but she had never visited it and had no reason to think about it. Her own children were healthy. There was no connection in her life to anything the voice was saying. "To help you see that we are sincere," the voice continued, "we would like you to check out the following." It then gave her 3 separate pieces of information that she did not know, specific facts that she could verify. She checked them. They were all true. AB became convinced that she had lost her mind. She went to see her doctor, who referred her to a psychiatrist named Dr. Ikechukwu Obialo Azuonye. Dr. Azuonye diagnosed her with a functional hallucinatory psychosis and prescribed medication. The voices went away, and AB went on holiday to celebrate her return to normalcy. But then, while she was abroad, the voices returned. They told her that she needed to return to England immediately. There was something wrong with her, they said, something that required urgent treatment. This time, the voices were more specific. They gave her an address in London. AB returned home and with her husband went to the address the voices had provided. It was the CT scan department of a major London hospital. As she arrived there, the voices spoke again. They told her to go inside and ask for a brain scan. They told her that she had a tumor in her brain and that her brainstem was inflamed. AB was terrified, but she believed the voices. They had been right about other things. She asked for the scan. Dr. Azuonye, who had been treating AB, was faced with a dilemma. He had examined her and found no physical signs of a brain tumor. There was nothing in her symptoms that suggested any intracranial problem, but his patient was convinced that the voices were telling the truth, and she was in tremendous distress. He requested a brain scan, explaining in his letter that hallucinatory voices had told his patient that she had a tumor, that he personally found no clinical evidence of this, and that the purpose of the scan was essentially to reassure her. The hospital initially declined the request. It was expensive, and there seemed to be no medical justification. But Dr. Azuña persisted, and eventually the scan was performed. The results were stunning. AB did have a brain tumor. It was a meningioma, a type of tumor that grows from the membranes surrounding the brain, and it was located exactly where the voices had said it would be. There was also evidence of inflammation in the brainstem, just as the voices had described. The tumor required immediate surgery. AB was admitted to the hospital, and the voices stayed with her throughout the process. They discussed the treatment options with her. They expressed a preference for a different hospital, one that specialized in neurological diseases, but they agreed that surgery should proceed where she was because the situation was urgent. The operation was successful. The tumor was removed without complications, and AB recovered normally. But there was one final surprise. When she awoke from the anesthesia, she heard the voices one last time. "We are pleased to have helped you," they said. "Goodbye," and then they were gone. AB never heard them again. Dr. Azuña followed up with his patient 12 years later. She remained healthy, with no recurrence of the tumor and no return of the voices. She had gone on with her life, her sanity intact, her story one of the strangest in the annals of medical literature. "This is the first and only instance I have come across," Dr. Azuña wrote, "in which hallucinatory voices sought to reassure the patient of their genuine interest in her welfare, offered her a specific diagnosis when there were no clinical signs that would have alerted anyone to the tumor, directed her to the type of hospital best equipped to deal with her problem, expressed pleasure that she had at last received the treatment they desired for her, bid her farewell, and thereafter disappeared." The case has never been satisfactorily explained. Some have suggested that AB must have had some unconscious awareness of her condition, some subtle symptom that her conscious mind did not recognize, but that her subconscious expressed through hallucinations. But this does not explain how the voices knew the location of the CT department, or how they knew the specific details of her diagnosis before any medical examination had been performed. Others have proposed more supernatural explanations, suggesting that AB was guided by angels or spirits or some other form of benevolent intelligence. But Dr. Azuña, like most medical professionals, is reluctant to venture into such territory. He has simply documented the case and left the interpretation to others. What remains is the fact that a woman with no medical symptoms and no reason to suspect illness heard voices that told her she had a brain tumor, directed her to the precise location where she could receive a scan, and then vanished forever once the tumor was removed. Whether this represents a remarkable quirk of neurology, a genuine paranormal event, or something else entirely remains one of the great mysteries of modern medicine. Dr. Stephanie Schwab is one of the world's foremost experts on underwater caves. A geomicrobiologist and cave diver, she has spent decades exploring the blue holes of the Bahamas, vertical cave systems that plunge deep beneath the ocean's surface into darkness and mystery. She is the founder of the Rob Palmer Blue Holes Foundation, named in honor of her late husband, who died during a dive in the Red Sea in 1997. Schwab is a scientist, trained to observe and analyze, to seek explanations grounded in evidence and reason. But she has also experienced something that science cannot fully explain: a brush with the third man factor that occurred during one of the most dangerous moments of her diving career. The details of her experience have been documented in various accounts, including the work of John Geiger. While solo diving in an underwater cave, Schwab became disoriented. In the darkness and silence of the subterranean world, she lost track of her position and her route to safety. Her air supply was limited. If she could not find her way out, she would drown in the blackness. It was in this moment of extreme peril that Schwab sensed a presence with her. She was alone in the cave, hundreds of feet below the surface, separated from any other living being. But something was there, guiding her, helping her find her way back to safety. She survived. She emerged from the cave and went on to continue her scientific work, her exploration of the hidden worlds beneath the sea. But the experience left a mark on her, a reminder that even the most rational among us can encounter something inexplicable in our darkest moments. Schwab's experience is particularly notable because of who she is. She is not a mystic or a spiritualist. She is a scientist with advanced degrees and a career built on empirical observation. If she had wanted to dismiss the experience as a hallucination or a trick of the mind, no one would have blamed her. But she has not dismissed it. She has acknowledged it as part of her story, one more data point in the growing body of evidence that something strange happens to people at the edge of survival. The underwater cave is perhaps the most hostile environment in which a human being can find themselves. The darkness is absolute, the silence is complete, and the margin for error is non-existent. A single wrong turn, a single equipment failure, a single moment of panic can mean death. Those who dive in caves accept these risks, but they also accept that in such an environment, anything can happen. What happened to Stephanie Schwab in that underwater labyrinth remains unexplained, but it saved her life, and she has never forgotten it. The stories we have explored tonight represent only a fraction of the documented cases of the third man factor. Across the decades and around the world, people facing impossible circumstances have reported remarkably similar experiences. In 1933, the British mountaineer Frank Smythe was attempting to become the first person to reach the summit of Mount Everest. Climbing alone above 28,000 feet, in the so-called death zone, where human bodies begin to fail, he experienced a powerful sensation of an unseen companion. The presence was so real to him that when he stopped to eat a piece of mint cake, he instinctively broke it in half and turned to offer the other piece to his companion. There was no one there. Smythe was a seasoned mountaineer who had climbed extensively in the Alps and the Himalayas. He was not a man given to fantasy or self-deception, but the presence he felt on Everest was so vivid, so compelling, that he could not deny its reality. He wrote about it afterward, describing the companion as a friendly presence, someone who seemed to understand his situation and wish him well. The experience did not help Smythe reach the summit. Bad weather and failing strength forced him to turn back before achieving his goal. But the companion stayed with him during his descent, offering a strange comfort in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Only when he rejoined his fellow climbers at a lower camp did the presence finally fade. Smythe's account added another significant data point to the growing body of third-man experiences. Here was a respected climber operating at extreme altitude with all the physiological challenges that entails, who experienced exactly the same phenomenon that Shackleton had described years earlier. The consistency was remarkable. Charles Lindbergh, the legendary aviator who became the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean in 1927, described a similar experience during his historic flight. His journey from New York to Paris took 33.5 hours, most of it over open ocean with no landmarks and no way to rest. By the midpoint of the flight, Lindbergh had been awake for more than 40 hours. He was hallucinating, struggling to stay conscious, fighting against the overwhelming desire to simply close his eyes and let the plane carry him wherever it would. It was during these desperate hours that Lindbergh became aware of presences in the cockpit with him. He described them as phantoms, vaguely outlined forms that hovered behind him and to the sides. They seemed to pass through the walls of the fuselage without difficulty, appearing and disappearing at will. But unlike most hallucinations, these presences were helpful rather than frightening. They spoke to him, though Lindbergh could never quite remember what they said. They offered reassurance during the long hours over the water. They seemed to understand his situation, to know things that he did not consciously know. And they stayed with him until land appeared on the horizon, and he knew that he would survive. Lindbergh was reluctant to discuss these experiences for many years. He was a public figure, perhaps the most famous man in the world after his flight, and he worried that talk of phantoms and presences would damage his reputation for clear-headed rationality. But late in life, he finally wrote about them in his autobiography, The Spirit of St. Louis, acknowledging that something extraordinary had happened during those hours over the Atlantic. Astronauts, too, have reported experiences that seem related to the third man factor. The extreme isolation of space, the knowledge that one is separated from every other living being by the vast emptiness of the void, can produce psychological effects that science is only beginning to understand. Some have described feelings of profound connection to something greater than themselves. Others have experienced more specific sensations of presence and guidance. The Apollo astronauts who traveled to the moon in the late 1960s and early 1970s sometimes spoke of overwhelming emotional and spiritual experiences during their journeys. Edgar Mitchell, who walked on the moon during Apollo 14, later described an epiphany that occurred as he gazed back at Earth from space. He felt a profound sense of interconnection with the universe, a conviction that everything was somehow alive and conscious. While this is not precisely the third man factor, it suggests that extreme isolation and novel environments can trigger altered states of consciousness that remain poorly understood. Prisoners of war, confined for years in isolation cells, have reported imaginary companions who helped them survive the unbearable loneliness of their captivity. American POWs held in Vietnam sometimes developed elaborate internal worlds populated by figures who offered companionship and support. These were not delusions in the clinical sense. These prisoners knew that their companions were not physically real, but they found genuine comfort and strength in these imagined presences. Shipwreck survivors, drifting alone on the open sea, have described voices that kept them from surrendering to despair. Accident victims, trapped in the wreckage of cars or buildings, have felt the presence of beings who told them to hold on, that help was coming. The consistency of these accounts across such different circumstances is one of the most compelling aspects of the third man factor. These are not people who share a common culture or a common belief system. They are mountaineers and traders, scientists and sailors, believers and skeptics. They come from every corner of the globe and every walk of life, and yet their experiences are strikingly similar. Something appears to them at the moment of greatest extremity. Something speaks to them, comforts them, guides them. Something refuses to let them die. And when safety is finally reached, that something vanishes, as if its work were complete. Scientists will continue to search for explanations grounded in neurology and psychology, and perhaps they will find them. Perhaps one day we will understand exactly which brain regions activate to produce the third man, which chemical cascades create the sensation of presence, which evolutionary pressures selected for this remarkable survival mechanism. But until that day comes, we are left with the stories themselves. We are left with Ernest Shackleton, stumbling across the frozen wastes of South Georgia with a companion who was not there. We are left with Ron DiFrancesco, rising from the floor of a burning stairwell because a voice told him to get up. We are left with Joe Simpson, crawling across a glacier with a shattered leg because something would not let him stop. These stories do not prove the existence of angels or guardian spirits. They do not validate any particular religious tradition or spiritual practice, but they remind us that in our darkest moments, we are not always as alone as we think. They remind us that the human experience contains mysteries that we have not yet solved, forces that operate beyond the edge of our understanding, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps what matters is not whether we can explain the third man, but whether we can recognize him when he comes. Because if these stories teach us anything, it is this: when the voice speaks, when the presence appears, when something unseen reaches out to us and refuses to let us go, we should listen, we should follow, we should get up, because that voice might just save our lives. If you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Unexplained Mysteries for Sleep. Your support helps us continue bringing you these fascinating true stories from the edges of human experience. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload, and leave a comment below sharing your own experiences or thoughts on tonight's topic. Thank you for listening, and sleep well.